10,000 BC, somewhere on the Eurasian steppes, a boy named Jack wanders out into the wild unknown, carrying with him only his wits and his courage. His goal: steal treasure from a giant in the sky. But this is no fairy tale. What Jack really steals is far more dangerous and far more permanent. Not to mention, there are similarities between the Chinese version and the European versions that suggest they all descend from an even older root. You see, our Jack and the Beanstalk was first written down in the late 1700s. That makes it seem like a timeless classic. But that version of the story is actually quite late, and most versions of the story aren't even European. In fact, it's probably more accurate to call it a world tree, because it's not just a path to the sky, it's a bridge between the mundane world of men and the divine realm of the gods. The oldest variant comes from ancient China, dating back to sometime around 800 AD, and Jack is about to find out why. This, of course, is the giant, but his appearance tells us something important. And while we can track its development through various intermediate versions, going all the way back to a book called the Prometheus, which dates back to around 200 AD, that still leaves a gap of 600 years. In fact, they usually represent natural forces like wind or storms, and this particular giant is the keeper of the world tree. Then he creeps forward and steals some treasure. In some versions, it's golden. In others, it's silver. But either way, it's not really treasure at all. The Chinese version calls him a celestial official, and the Slavic versions refer to him as a dragon. But in the end, he's just a giant. In other words, if we want to get to the bottom of Jack and the Beanstalk, we have to go beyond the written record. We have to dig deep into the earliest myths, stories that were likely first told around campfires, before there even was such a thing as writing. Now, this is important. Shepherding is a distinctly Indo-European tradition that played a major role in the development of civilization. In other words, the people who first heard these stories would have lived in fear of the nomadic horsemen who carried them. By severing the world tree and trapping the storm giant in a stone pillar, he cuts off the link between the gods and humanity. And it's an ancient one, dating back thousands of years. The boundary between the physical world and the spiritual world has been broken down, and the two realms are merging together. The treasure is infused with the power of the gods, and Jack has just stolen a little bit of that power for himself. Well, we have to remember that the original audience wouldn't have been Bronze Age people. But no, not in the modern sense. Fairy tales preserve cultural memories, but this story actively erases one culture and paves the way for another. He becomes a permanent fixture on the landscape, a monument to a time when the gods walked the earth. In the most complete version, which comes from the Danish collection, he wakes up and gives chase, smashing the beanstalk in his anger. So is Jack and the Beanstalk a fairy tale? Well, yes and no. It's the story of a boy who climbed into the sky and cut the world's tree forever. It's a podcast that retells the oldest myths in the world, from the Mesopotamian tale of the goddess who birthed the sun to the Egyptian myth of the man who sailed across the underworld. It's the story of the death of the old gods and the birth of civilization. So if you want to hear the next chapter in the forgotten lore of our world, then follow the link in the description. To the Neolithic people, he's a godless monster who steals their connection to the gods. And that brings us to the steppes of 10,000 BC, where our story starts with a young man named Jack tending his father's flock. He climbed a world tree, fought a giant storm spirit, stole magic from the gods, and then rode away on a cloud. Jack's task is to watch over the sheep, but instead he gets distracted by a mysterious plant with beautiful blossoms. When he reaches out to touch them, the plant transforms into a beanstalk, and Jack finds himself climbing up into the clouds. The giant isn't so lucky. He smashes into the ground, turning into a stone pillar that watches over the bean field where Jack first climbed into the sky. This beanstalk, mind you, is no ordinary beanstalk, and when their petals fall to the ground, they turn into precious jewels. And what Jack does next proves it. Instead of picking beans, he plucks flowers from the sky. These flowers are magical. They can grant wishes. This reinforces the idea that this story isn't about beans or beanstalks. It's about the sky and the forces that govern it. As he continues climbing, he hears loud footsteps approaching, and soon enough, he sees the source, a gigantic hairy man with long flowing hair. Giants in early Indo-European mythology are not just big and strong, they're connected to nature. He's the one who guards the border between heaven and earth, and he uses his size and his strength to protect it. And Jack outsmarts him. tricking him into going back to sleep. It's magic. But the giant isn't finished with him yet. Jack falls, but luckily he grabs onto a passing cloud and rides it all the way home. Now, this might sound like a simple folktale, but let's take another look at what Jack has just done. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a ritual. It's a theft from the divine. It's a myth about the cost of civilization. But how does that work? How could a Bronze Age shepherd steal from the gods and survive to tell the tale? They would have been part of the Neolithic culture that came before the Indo-European invasion. So what Jack really steals isn't treasure or magic. It's the connection between heaven and earth. That is why some versions of the story say that Jack plants the magic beans in the ground and the whole field becomes magical. The giant, meanwhile, doesn't die. So is Jack a hero or a villain? Well, that depends on whether you ask a Neolithic farmer or an invading warrior. To the warriors, he's a clever young man who frees them from a world dominated by giants. Yes, because it was originally a ritual, a reenactment of a cosmic battle between a Neolithic tribe and an invading horde. It's a violent and unsettling tale, but it captures a pivotal moment in human history. So if you hear someone singing, Fifi behind the nursery rhyme is a much darker truth. And now you know the forgotten truth behind Jack and the Beanstalk. But there are many other myths and legends that have also been lost to time. These myths were once living traditions, but today they've been reduced to cheap Halloween costumes and mass-produced candy. Luckily, I've got a treat for you. If you love the forgotten lore I uncover here on this channel, you'll love lore. It's the perfect way to keep the stories alive. And the best part is that new episodes premiere every Wednesday.